The jury has officially begun their deliberations in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal trial after weeks of testimony and evidence. The case is now in their hands. Will they find him guilty or not guilty of the federal sex crimes charges? Will they? Behung tell you what we're going to dive into what happened today, including a question from the jury that shocked us all. Welcome to Sidebar presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. We are now officially in verdict watch in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal case. Jurors were sent back to deliberate today. They had a interesting series of notes from the jurors too, which we're going to talk about. And we also heard the jury instructions, which, let me tell you right now, so complicated. Okay, so complex. I wonder if the jury is going to just have difficulty with them. I wouldn't be surprised. I really wouldn't be surprised. And remember, what's at stake here? Racketeering, conspiracy, sex trafficking, transportation to engage in prostitution. These are not simple charges to digest or apply to all the evidence in this case. But remember, Sean Combs, if found guilty, he could face decades or even life in prison if he's convicted of all of these charges. So we want to talk about what happened today in court, and let me bring on Long Crimes in Court reporter Elizabeth Milner. Fan favorite Elizabeth, great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time. So first up, where are we in the deliberations process? How long have they been going before they requested to go home at 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern? Well, they've been going for quite a while, Jesse. So far a little. It's close to 5 hours of deliberation, so they're getting pretty in there, and that's only been on day one. Obviously, they came back with a note that says that they are ready to leave at 5 o'clock p.m. today, so unfortunately, they didn't go past 5 o'clock. Or anything like that. They're not still continuing on with their deliberations, but they will start bright and early again tomorrow morning. But it's interesting, Jesse, because already they've having some pretty interesting questions for the judge as to what their jury instructions and their the jury charge is. Let's talk about that. There were, I think, 3 notes. There was 1 note, and then there was 2 notes at the end. Let's start with the first note. Happened shortly after they went back to deliberate. What was that note about? Yeah? Well, the first note right off the top was a simple note, or at least I think it was a simple note, was that the jury had decided who their person is going to be, and that was juror number 5. Now, a lot of us had a couple questions in terms of if it's juror number 5 going back to voir dire and that juror number that was assigned to them then, or does it have to correlate with their seat numbers? But I think we kind of all figured it out. It was kind of going back to the voir dire process. So what we know about juror number 5 is who, again, is a person who's a religious man. He is an investment analyst. He's a Connecticut country club member, and so he's going to be the one taking charge. And I think once the jury comes to their decision, he'll be reading that note out loud in front of the court, in front of a lot of people who are anticipating that verdict too. That's right. And then we got the controversial note, the big note everybody was talking about again relatively early on in the deliberation process. Yeah, pretty early on. It came about 1:30 p.m. That's when the judge had read the note out loud, but I think the actual message of the note came back probably maybe 20 or so minutes or close to an hour beforehand, actually, that it had to kind of pertain to juror number 25. And so this particular knot was that juror number 25 can't follow instructions, and those instructions being the judge's instructions. And so initially the court was proposing to write back, okay, please explain the nature of your concern. Is it a lack of understanding? Is it unwillingness to follow the instructions? But even as it pertains to juror number 25, what we do know about this particular juror, he's 51 years old, he's a man, and he is a scientist. That again, going back to voir dire learning a little bit about these jurors and knowing a little bit about their background. So that's what we've learned of him. So initially the defense was like, okay, we're a little hesitant to lay out just all the different possibilities. Just ask them to kind of work through everything. They're still early in their deliberations. They still have a lot of time to consider. So that was the defense's initial proposed instruction, whereas the government was like, Okay, I think we should be a little more specific. They wanted to review some of the cases or the case laws too. And so their proposal was, I received your note. I remind every juror to remember my instructions. Please make sure that the note doesn't reveal which way the juror is leaning. So then they kind of took a little bit of time, worked out their issues, couldn't come back to a decision at the end of it. So the judge ended up kind of making his own decision in terms of the proposed note to go back to the juror, and it was pretty much a neutral way that kind of, I think, appeased maybe both parties, or maybe not so much the defense as it did the government, but it was a way to kind of neutralize everything. And then for a while, Jesse, we didn't have a note for a few hours, and so then towards the end of the day, we got that one of the final notes from the jury. Hey, so I know you guys might be into true crime, but little side note, anybody out there also in a business of some kind? If so, let me tell you real quick about ODU, our sponsor. Why? ODU is a powerful all-in-one business software that helps you manage everything from sales to accounting and, yes, inventory. Their inventory dashboard makes it easy to track receipts, delivery orders, POS orders, and see what's waiting late or backcarded. All at a glance, you can pay for receipts, automate vendor reminders, and schedule deliveries all in just a few clicks. Plus, you'll get full warehouse management, the ability to set picking strategies, and real-time stock visibility. The best part? Odo's inventory app syncs seamlessly with your sales and e-commerce app, so everything stays connected. Do you want an inventory software that comes fully packed? Well, listen to this. Check out ODU for a free 15-day trial at Odo.et. At Odo, Cediber inventory. And to be clear, we have no idea what it means when this juror allegedly is accused of not following instructions. Does it mean, hey, I've already made a decision? I'm not looking at anything in the jury instructions. I'm not looking at any of the evidence. I think he's guilty. I think he's not guilty. We have no idea. It could be that. It could be something specific in the jury instructions that the juror does not want to follow, because there are a lot of instructions in that 6 2-page packet. No idea. But to be clear real quick, there are alternates, right? There are alternates if something happens and this juror is an issue, or there's another juror that's an issue, or there's a juror gets sick or something like this, or has a conflict. They do have jurors on standby, right? They do have jurors on standby. However, they're not in the deliberation room when the jury and the main jury, that being the first 12 that were assigned to this particular jurium. So there the alternates were able to go home if there was ever a situation where an alternate needed to be called in to kind of be tagged out with one of the other jurors. And again, we haven't gotten there yet, so all the alternates are not in the main jury room at all. They're not even in the courthouse. They went back home. However, they gave jury staff members their contact information, which included their phone numbers. So if there is a situation that arises where an alternate needs to be called in, they're able to get a hold of them just by the court staff getting a hold of their contact information that they gave to them before they were eventually dismissed. Now, the final note, the final two notes, one was, we want to go. You, no home at 5 o'clock p.m. They were allowed to stay longer if they wanted to, that they wanted to go home, but we finally got a substantive note in terms of the actual charges, and talked to us about what that note was about. They had a very specific question regarding an actual charge. Yeah, they had a very specified question, to your point, Jesse, and it had to do with what was on page 37 of the jury charge, and that was the jury instructions. And so the note read, referring to page 37, if a person wants request or ask for controlled substances, has the individual distributed? And I think that was a pretty interesting note, given that one of the counts, especially one of the predicate acts, is drug distribution. And so I think maybe the jury was kind of confused, possibly on the language of the law that was written, or maybe they just wanted some more clarification as it particularly pertained to drug distribution under count 1 under the RICO conspiracy. And so what ended up happening is that, yes, to your point, Jesse, the jury was dismissed at 5 o'clock p.m. today. They were able to go home for the end of the day because I know a lot of people have been asking whether or not this jury has been sequestered. They are not sequestered. They are free to go home at the end of the day. They're just not allowed to discuss the case. They're not allowed to watch any documentaries, movies. They cannot watch the sidebar episode. So if any juror is watching the sidebar episode, you know that cannot be a thing. But what ended up happening is after the jury was dismissed, the court had come up with a suggestion to answer their question, and the initial suggestion by the court, so by the judge, was to refer to page 37, lines 1 through 3 of the jury charge. However, he said that both sides can kind of wait until tomorrow to give their proposed kind of note back to the jury. So what the government's response was, though, was that they were kind of concerned about that specific instruction, and they wanted this particular note back to the jury to go that, yes, they wanted literally the words yes to be written in the note back, and they say yes, but also give that proposed instruction about referring back to page 37, specifically lines 1 through 3. However, obviously the defense was going to have issue to it, because if you're thinking about a note going back and it's saying, yes, this person is distributing, obviously that's not going to look too good for the defense. So the defense kind of were just like, okay, wait, let's have a little more time to kind of think things through, talk things out with, my colleagues, as well as confer with the government about things. And so what they're going to do, Jesse, is they're going to confer until about 6:00 p.m. Today, then they're going to probably write it in a form of like a letter to the judge or an email, that type of sort, give it back to the judge, and then they'll discuss it further bright and early tomorrow morning when court begins at 9:00 a.m. And that's interesting, the drug distribution part of racketeering conspiracy, arguably maybe one of the stronger underlying predicate crimes to get to racketeering. Conspiracy. Let's talk about this, because I have to say jury instructions are usually a snore. They're usually really, really boring in a case, particularly when you have a straightforward charge of, let's say, like a murder charge, right? This case? These jury instructions, 62 pages, are so important. They are so specific. They are so complex. These are not easy to understand charges, so I think it's going to I wonder if it's going to take the jury some time just to go over them and understand what they're assigned to be doing, what the elements are. So I want to go over some of the jury instructions that were read aloud today in court. Their application to the case, again, really important, because this is the law that the jury will use to guide them. Very dense, not going to go through it all, but here are some highlights that I took out. So aside from the basic instructions on, role of the court and the jury, the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, circumstantial evidence. First, direct evidence. They got into the elements of the charges, and the government has to prove each of these beyond a reasonable doubt. So, first of all, when we talk about racketeering conspiracy, arguably the most complex charge, it says, quote, first, that in or about 2004 through in or about 2024, so 20 years, there was an agreement among two or more persons to conduct or participate in the affairs of an enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity. Elizabeth, how do you think the prosecution did to try to prove, hey, everyone, Sean Combs' assistants, his bodyguards, his inner circle, they all agreed to this? How do you think they did about that from what you heard in this case so far? Yeah, well, I think that was the big thing, right, Jesse? Is this whole alleged criminal enterprise, and according to the government, and according to the allegations made by the government, that Sean Combs is at the head of this alleged criminal enterprise. So, throughout this child, what have we learned about the alleged co-conspirators? That being Christina Caroma, that being security guards like Troke and Faheim, but also what we've learned too is what the government calls his foot soldiers, and that being the assistants. The assistants kind of, in a way, doing Sean Combs' bidding, whether it is procuring drugs, whether it be a small amount for personal use, as the defense might say, or whether it be drug supplies that were also used in these free-coffs. Because, according to the government, drugs were an essential ingredient for these free cops or hotel nights, wild debauchery nights, whatever you want to call them. And so I think in terms of just showing, I know a lot of us were kind of like more text messages, more texts, more audio messages, all of that stuff, but really kind of hearing how the assistants would communicate not only with Sean Combs, but also again his alleged co-conspirator, that being Christina Caroam, whether it's to get reimbursement for drugs or get reimbursement for personal supplies that the assistants would use to pay for. With their own money get reimbursement through the company and things of that sort. And so in terms of just count one, and that being the racketeering conspiracy, I think the government made a pretty strong case now, whether or not the jury agrees that is kind of the question going forward now. And that's just one element, right? So that was just one element. Was there an agreement? Okay. The second element was that the racketeering enterprise or its activities would have affected or in fact affected interstate or foreign commerce. And on that point, it says interstate or foreign commerce simply means the movement of goods, services, money, and individuals between any two or more states or between one state. In the District of Columbia, or between a state and a U.S. territory, or a possession, or between the United States and a foreign country, all narcotics activity. Even purely local narcotics activity has an effect on interstate commerce now, Elizabeth. I guess that's all about transporting Jane and Cassie Ventura. It's fine for alleged sex trafficking and prostitution and drug offenses, right? That's the big theme there, right? Yeah, absolutely. And it was something that, again, I think a lot of people are like, okay, it's sex trafficking as counts 2 and 4, but it also kind of falls under KWA a little bit too. Because, in terms of just interstate or foreign commerce, that was affected according to the government. The defendant knowingly recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, provided, or maintained the victim. The defendant knew or recklessly disregarded that force or, threats of force, fraud, or coercion, or any of the combination of force, fraud, or coercion would be used to cause the victim to engage in commercial sex act. And again, pointing back to interstate or foreign commerce, were affected because if you think about just going to one of the summary charts or one of the summary exhibits where you're seeing flight records where Jane or Cassie Ventura, even back when Cassie was in a relationship with Sean Combs, Jane was in a relationship with Sean Combs, what you could see from those flight records is flights traveling either from Los Angeles to Miami or from Los Angeles to New York City, or vice versa. Some, even in instances, traveling to Turks and Cows, as Jane had recalled during her testimony. And so in terms of just interstate foreign commerce, again, the government kind of pointing to that, these fall under the elements of sex trafficking, whether it's sex trafficking under RICO or it also kind of pertains to counts 2. And for that being sex trafficking to Cassie and sex trafficking to Jane too. And yeah, that's an important element as well as, and I think this is the one I want to explore with you too. So third is the defendant knowingly and willfully join that agreement. And fourth is that the defendant knowingly and willfully agreed that he or another member of the conspiracy would commit to racketeering acts. This is what we talk about the underlying predicate crimes, right? And that's where it lists out kidnapping, arson, bribery, tampering with a witness, victim or informant, forced labor, sex trafficking, transportation, and inducement to travel for purposes of prostitution and other illegal sexual activities, possession with intent to distribute or distribution of narcotics and controlled substances. And there are theories for each one of these, like kidnapping or aiding in abetting kidnapping. By the way, there are detailed descriptions of each underlying crime too. There is so much for this jury to process. Again, I can't emphasize that enough. Massive undertaking for this jury, so much law to consider. Now, Elizabeth, out of those underlying crimes, okay? And they need to find that there was a conspiracy to commit 2 of them, right? Which do you feel would be the easier to prove, which stood out to you from the prosecution's case, and which maybe are you? Like, I don't know, because let me tell you, on the verdict form, they have to list out which ones were proven, which ones they were unanimously proven. Yeah, well, I think the ones that stood out to me I've already talked about drug distribution, I've already talked about kidnapping, but I'm just going to kind of add two more to that list too, and I'm going to talk about arson and bribery. So, for example, arson pertaining to what had happened in January of 2012, because I remember when the government was giving their closing argument, they listed out all the participants of cutters of what had happened with Kid Cudi's car in the Porsche, and that included D-Rock, who set up the meeting between Sean Combs and Kid Kai after the fact that included Rue, who allegedly went over there with Capricorn Clark and Sean Combs over to, Kid Cudi's home. And so, the jury was able to see photos of Kid Kai's burnt car. They've been able to see these photos too. They've released them, and so everybody has been able to see them at this point. And so while there's this kind of lingering question on whether or not the defendant may have had involvement in this, according to the government, they say, of course, the defendant was behind this 100%. The government is sure that Sean Combs is behind this Molotov cocktail, whether or not he was the one who, Now, there's always been a kind of a conversation on whether or not he was the one who threw it, but according to the defense, there was partial female DNA that was found on the bottle. But according to just some of the other pieces of evidence that the government was able to show the jury, including, messages from Cassie Ventura, where she had alleged that Sean Combs was planning to blow up Kid Kai's car, and it wouldn't be at his hands. He'd be out of the country when this was going on, and so, according to the government, the evidence suggested that Sean Combs had something to do with this Molotov cocktail that was lodged into Kid Kai's car back in 2012, I think. Another interesting one to Jesse is bribery, as one of the predicate acts that I might think could be easiest to prove, or that the government has already kind of proved it. And that has to deal with what had happened in Los Angeles, California in March of 2016 at the Intercontinental Hotel over there, where Sean Combs had paid $100,000 for that surveillance tape. Now, while the defense says it was because of a PR standpoint that Cassie and both Sean Combs didn't want to look bad or anything like that, it was nothing nefarious. It was nothing about preventing a witness from going to law enforcement or bringing this information to police.